Chapter 8. Camp 1. April 16, 1996. 19,500 feet. I doubt if anyone would claim to enjoy life at high altitudes. Enjoy, that is, in the ordinary sense of the word. There is a certain grim satisfaction to be derived from struggling upwards, however slowly. But the bulk of one's time is necessarily spent in the extreme squalor of a high camp, when even this solace is lacking. Smoking is impossible. Eating tends to make one vomit. The necessity of reducing weight to a bare minimum forbids the importation of literature beyond that supplied by the labels on tins of food. Sardine oil, condensed milk, and treacle spill themselves all over the place, except for the briefest moments, during which one is not usually in a mood for aesthetic enjoyment. There is nothing to look at but the bleak confusion inside the tent and the scaly, bearded countenance of one's companion. Fortunately, the noise of the wind usually drowns out his stuffy breathing. Worst of all is the feeling of complete helplessness and inability to deal with any emergency that might arise. I used to try to console myself with the thought that a year ago I would have been thrilled by the very idea of taking part in our present adventure, a prospect that had then seemed like an impossible dream. But altitude has the same effect on the mind as upon the body. One's intellect becomes dull and unresponsive, and my only desire was to finish the wretched job and to get down to a more reasonable climb. Eric Shipton. Upon that mountain. Just before dawn on Tuesday, April 16th, after resting for 2 days at base camp, we headed up into the icefall to begin our second acclimatization excursion. As I nervously threaded my way through the frozen, groaning disorder, I noticed that my breathing wasn't quite as labored as it had been during our first trip up the glacier. Already my body was starting to adapt to the altitude. My dread of getting crushed by a falling serac, however, was at least as great as before. I'd hoped that the giant overhanging tower at 19,000 feet, christened the Mousetrap by some wag on Fisher's team, had toppled by now, but it was still precariously upright, leaning even farther over. Again, I redlined my cardiovascular output, rushing to ascend from its threatening shadow, and again dropped to my knees when I arrived on the serac's summit, gasping for air and trembling from the excess of adrenaline fizzing through my veins. Unlike our first acclimatization sally, during which we stayed at Camp 1 for less than an hour before returning to base camp, Rob intended for us to spend Tuesday and Wednesday nights at Camp 1, and then continue up to Camp 2 for 3 additional nights before heading down. Angdorje hailed from Pangboche, an aggregation of stone-walled houses and terraced potato fields clinging to a rugged hillside at 13,000 feet. His father is a respected climbing Sherpa, who taught him the basics of mountaineering at an early age so that the boy would have marketable skills. By the time Angdorje was in his teens, his father had lost most of his sight to cataracts, and Angdorje was pulled from school to earn money for the family. In 1984, he was working as a cook boy for a group of Western trekkers when he caught the attention of a Canadian couple, Marion Boyd and Graham Nelson. According to Boyd, I was missing my kids, and as I grew to know Angdorje, he reminded me of my eldest son. Angdorje was bright, interested, keen to learn, and conscientious almost to a fault. He was carrying a huge load and he had nosebleeds every day at high altitude. I was intrigued. After seeking the approval of Angdorje's mother, Boyd and Nelson started supporting the young Sherpa financially so that he could return to school. I will never forget his entry exam to gain admission to the regional primary school in Kumjung, built by Sir Edmund Hillary. He was very small in stature and prepubescent. We were crammed into a small room with the headmaster and 4 teachers. Angdorje stood in the middle with his knees quaking as he tried to resurrect the bit of formal learning he had for this oral exam. We all sweated blood, but he was accepted with the proviso that he would have to sit with the little kids in the first grades. Angdorje became an able student and achieved the equivalent of an 8th grade education before quitting to go back to work in the mountaineering and trekking industry. Boyd and Nelson, who returned to the Khumbu several times, witnessed his maturation. With access for the first time to a good diet, he began to grow tall and strong, recalls Boyd. He told us with great excitement when he learned to swim in a pool in Kathmandu. At age 25 or so, he learned to ride a bicycle and took a brief fancy to the music of Madonna. We knew he was really grown up when he presented us with his first gift, a carefully selected Tibetan carpet. He wanted to be a giver, not a taker. As Ang Dorje's reputation for being a strong and resourceful climber spread among Western climbers, he was promoted to the role of Sirdar, and in 1992 he went to work for Rob Hall on Everest. By the launch of Hall's 1996 expedition, Ang Dorje had climbed the peak 3 times. With respect and obvious affection, Hall referred to him as "my main man," and mentioned several times that he considered Ang Dorje's role crucial to the success of our expedition. The sun was bright when the last of my teammates pulled into Camp 1, but by noon a scum of high cirrus had blown in from the south. By 3 o'clock dense clouds swirled above the glacier, and snow pelted the tents with a furious clamor. It stormed through the night. In the morning, when I crawled out of the shelter I shared with Doug, more than a foot of fresh snow blanketed the glacier. Dozens of avalanches rumbled down the steep walls above, but our camp was safely beyond their reach. At first light on Thursday, April 18th, by which time the sky had cleared, we gathered our belongings and embarked for Camp 2, 4 miles and 1,700 vertical feet above. The route took us up the gently sloping floor of the Western Khum, the highest box canyon on Earth, a horseshoe-shaped defile gouged from the heart of the Everest Massif by the Khumbu Glacier. The 25,790-foot ramparts of Nuptse defined the right wall of the Khum. Everest's massive southwest face formed the left wall, and the broad frozen thrust of the Lhotse face loomed above its head. The temperature had been brutally cold when we set out from Camp 1, turning my hands into stiff, aching claws. But as the first of the sun's rays struck the glacier, the ice-spackled walls of the Khum collected and amplified the radiant heat like a huge solar oven. Suddenly I was sweltering, and I feared the onset of another migraine-intensity headache, like the one that had hammered me at base camp. So I stripped down to my long underwear and stuffed a fistful of snow beneath my baseball cap. For the next 3 hours I slogged steadily up the glacier, pausing only to drink from my water bottle and replenish the snow supply in my hat as it melted into my matted hair. At 21,000 feet, dizzy from the heat, I came upon a large object wrapped in blue plastic sheeting beside the trail. It took my altitude-impaired gray matter a minute or two to comprehend that the object was a human body. Shocked and disturbed, I stared at it for several minutes. That night when I asked Rob about it, he said he wasn't certain, but he thought the victim was a Sherpa who'd died 3 years earlier.